At my father's funeral, my stepmother stood up beside the casket and told 300 people I had stolen from the family. The whole room turned to look at me. I set down the folder I'd been holding, walked to the front of the chapel, and said, "Since we're talking about who took what, let me show everyone the wire transfers." Her face went the color of the lilies on the coffin. "She drained his accounts," my stepmother said again, louder this time, like she wanted the people in the back to hear it clearly. "While he was dying, while we were grieving, this is the kind of person my husband called a daughter." I stood in the third pew with my coat still on. My father had been dead 9 days. The chapel smelled like carnations and cold air and the inside of a building that gets used for one sad thing after another. I'd written my eulogy on an index card that was now sweating in my coat pocket. I never got to read it. Before I tell you what was in that folder, I want to say thank you for being here with me. If you believe that the truth matters more than appearances and that the people who get hurt the most are usually the ones who stayed quiet the longest, this story is for you. Stay with me. It gets worse before it gets better, and then it gets better than I ever expected. Her name was Brenna, and she'd been married to my father for 6 years. She had a way of crying that didn't ruin her makeup. I'd watched her do it at the hospital, in the lawyer's office, and now here at the front of a funeral home in suburban Ohio, with one manicured hand pressed flat against her chest like she was holding her own heart in place. "I have the bank records," she went on, and a man I didn't recognize, her brother, I learned later, handed her a stack of papers with a flourish, like Babe rehearsed it. $60,000. Gone. From the accounts I shared with him. Who else had access? Who was at the house every single day at the end? That part was true. I had been at the house every day. I'd quit a contract job to be there. I'd learned how to crush his pills into applesauce because he couldn't swallow anymore. I'd slept in a recliner that left a permanent crick in my neck. I'd held a basin while he was sick and told him it was fine. It was nothing. Go back to sleep, Dad. So when she said who was at the house every day, 300 heads turned toward me, and I understood exactly what she'd done. She'd waited for the one room where I couldn't fight back without looking like a monster. A funeral. My father's funeral. She picked the stage on purpose. I should have crumbled. That's the thing she was counting on. The grieving daughter, publicly accused, bursting into tears and running out the side door while everyone whispered. By Monday, it would be the only version of the story anyone remembered. The Caldwell girl, you know the one, robbed her own father on his deathbed. I didn't cry. I reached into my coat and took out the folder. "You're right that money is missing," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. The room went so quiet I could hear the heater click on. $62,400 to be exact. And you're right that I know who took it. I've known for 3 months. Brenna's hand came off her chest. I want to back up, because none of this makes sense without knowing who my father was and who I was to him, and how a man that good ended up married to a woman like that. My mother died when I was 11. Ovarian cancer? The kind that hides until it's everywhere. After she was gone, it was just me and my dad in a house that suddenly had too many rooms. His name was Walt. He sold commercial HVAC systems, which is the least romantic job in America, and he was the gentlest person I have ever known. He kept a list on the fridge of things my mother used to say, so we wouldn't forget the sound of her. He taught me to drive in a church parking lot and never once raised his voice when I clipped the curb. When I got into college on a partial scholarship, he cried in the kitchen and then pretended he'd been chopping onions, even though we both knew there were no onions. For a long time, it was just the two of us, and that was enough. I moved to Columbus after school, did graphic design and then project management, the kind of career that's hard to explain at parties. I called him every Sunday. I came home for every holiday and a lot of ordinary weekends too, because I liked his company more than almost anyone's. He met Brenna when he was 61. She was 48, recently divorced, and she sold high-end real estate in a part of town where the houses had names. She was charming in the practice way of people who close deals for a living. The first time I met her, she held both my hands in both of hers and told me she'd heard so much about me and she just knew we were going to be close. I remember thinking that was a strange thing to promise a stranger. I tried. I want that on the record. I tried to like her. My dad was happy. Or at least he was less alone, and I wasn't going to be the daughter who couldn't stand to see her widowed father smile again. So I went to the dinners. I sat through the wine she picked out specifically so she could explain it to us. I bit my tongue when she redecorated my childhood home, and the list of my mother's sayings disappeared off the fridge. I asked him about it once, gently, and he got quiet and said Brenna thought it was morbid. That was the first time I felt the temperature of the house change. It happened slowly, the way these things do. I'd call on Sunday and he wouldn't pick up, and later, he'd text that they'd been at brunch with her friends. I'd planned to come home for Thanksgiving and find out they booked a trip to Scottsdale. When I did see him, there was always a third person in the room, narrating, redirecting, finishing his sentences. I told myself I was being possessive. He was allowed a life. I was a grown woman in another city. What kind of daughter resents her father for being loved? The kind, it turns out, whose instincts were right the whole time. He got sick the spring he turned 67. Pancreatic. They caught it late, which is the only way they ever catch it. I drove down the day he called me, and I remember standing in the kitchen of my old house, the kitchen where he'd cried over onions that weren't there, and Brenna telling me there was really no need for me to disrupt my life. They had it handled. She'd hired a service. I looked at my father, gray and small in a chair that used to swallow me whole when I was a kid, and I said I was staying. He reached out and held my hand and didn't say anything, but his grip said please, so I stayed. And here is where I started to see things. I'm not naive about money. I'd manage budgets for a living, so when I started helping with the household, sorting the mail because my dad couldn't focus on it anymore, I noticed things. A credit card I didn't recognize. A second card. A line of credit against the house he paid off years ago, the house my mother died in. Withdrawals in amounts that didn't match any treatment, any pharmacy, any home health service. A $4,000 charge at a spa resort in March when my father was too weak to make it to the bathroom alone. I didn't say anything at first. I told myself there were explanations. Maybe he'd given her access for convenience. Maybe these were old accounts. But I'm methodical, and grief gives you a lot of long nights, so I started keeping copies. Quietly. I'd photograph statements on the kitchen table at 2 a.m. while the house slept. I made a folder, the literal kind, and I wrote dates on the backs of receipts I found in coat pockets and in the recycling. I wasn't planning revenge. I want to be clear about that. I thought in the beginning that I was protecting my father from a mistake and that someday I'd sit him down and we'd look at it together and figure out what to do. But he was dying, and you don't hand a dying man a folder of betrayal. So I waited, and I watched, and I kept everything. The thing that broke me wasn't the money. It was the morning I came downstairs early and heard her on the phone in the den, voice low, not knowing I was there. She was talking to her brother. She said the word estate. She said, as soon as it's over. She said, about my father, the man giving me a weak thumbs up from his bed every morning when I brought his coffee. She said, he won't last past the spring, and then we just have to deal with the daughter. Deal with the daughter. I stood in the hallway with 2 mugs in my hands, and I didn't make a sound. I went back upstairs, and I sat on the edge of the bathtub, and I shook, and then I got very, very calm. That's the part I didn't know about myself until that morning. I have a temper that turns to ice instead of fire. I called a lawyer that afternoon from my car, parked at the grocery store. I told her everything. She told me something I didn't know. In Ohio, a surviving spouse has rights to a portion of an estate that are very hard to override, but that didn't cover assets that had been taken fraudulently, and it absolutely didn't cover what's called elder financial exploitation, which is a crime, not just a sad family disagreement. She told me to keep documenting. She told me to make copies of the copies. She told me gently that the hardest thing would be the timing, because I couldn't move against Brenna while my father was alive without potentially upending his last weeks. Did I want his final memories to be a war? No, I didn't. So I made a decision that I will defend until the day I die. I let my father go in peace. I sat with him every night. I read to him. I told him about my mother, the version of her he was forgetting, the church parking lot version, the onion version. The last clear thing he said to me, 2 days before the end, was, "You're the best thing I ever did." Brenna was in Scottsdale that weekend. She'd called it self-care. He died on a Tuesday morning with his hand in mine. I was the only one in the room. And then I had 9 days. 9 days while she planned a funeral that was really a coronation, while she ordered the lilies and chose the readings and told the funeral director, who told me later because he felt sorry for me, that the prominent grieving widow would speak and the daughter would be kept brief. 9 days while I sat with my folder and my grief and my lawyer's phone number, and I decided I was done being kept brief. I didn't plan to do it at the funeral. I want you to believe that because it matters to me. I had a meeting set with my lawyer for the following week. I was going to do it quietly, through the courts, the way you're supposed to. The folder in my coat that day held copies I'd brought to give the funeral director. Of all things, proof of the medical bills I'd paid out of my own pocket, because Brenna's brother had implied to a cousin that I hadn't contributed a dime, and I'm human, and I wanted at least the family to know the truth. She's the one who chose the stage. She stood up beside my father's casket in front of 300 people who'd loved him, and she pointed at me and called me a thief. So I made a different decision. I decided she could have the stage she built. I'd just be the one standing on it when the lights came up. $62,400, I said again, and I opened the folder. I can tell you the exact figure because I've been tracking it for 3 months. I have every statement. I have the dates. And the wire transfers you're so worried about didn't go out of his accounts to me. I looked right at her. They went to an account in your name, and to your brother, the one standing next to you. A sound went through the room, a kind of collective inhale. Brenna's brother took a step back from her, which I noticed, and which I think everyone noticed. There's a $4,000 charge from a spa resort in March, I said, reading now, because I'd organized it, because that's who I am. There's a home equity line opened against a house my father paid off in 2009, opened in February, while he was on a fentanyl patch and couldn't have signed his own name. There are $11,000 in cash advances. There's a card he never applied for because I have his actual application history, and his signature on this one doesn't match anything he signed in 40 years. I had a document examiner look at it. I have the report. That last part landed. You could feel it land. Brenna had been ready for a crying daughter. She had not been ready for a document examiner's report. You want to talk about who was at the house every day, I said, and my voice finally cracked, just once, and I let it, because it was true and I wasn't ashamed of it. I crushed his pills. I changed his sheets. I was holding his hand when he died, while you were getting a massage in Arizona and calling it grief. So yes, I was there. And because I was there, I saw everything. I closed the folder. The chapel was dead silent, except for the heater, and somewhere in the back, a woman quietly crying. One of my father's old work friends, I found out later, who'd known something was wrong for a long time and never had the words. I wasn't going to do this here, I said, and now I was talking to the room, to all of them, the cousins and the neighbors and the men he'd worked with for 30 years. I had a meeting with a lawyer next week. I was going to handle it the quiet way because that's what he would have wanted, and because this is his day and he deserved better than this. I looked at the casket, at the lilies she'd chosen, and my throat closed for a second. But she decided to stand up next to him and lie about me with his body still in the room. So no, not this time, not about this. Brenna's brother was already moving toward the exit. She reached for his arm and missed. The accounts are frozen, I added, because my lawyer had filed for it the day after he died, the moment I legally could. As of yesterday, the exploitation report's been filed with the county. I gave a statement Monday. So whatever you were planning to do with that house, you're going to want to call your own lawyer, not mine. I didn't shout any of it. That's what I keep coming back to. I'd imagined, in the dark months of 2 a.m. photographs, that this moment would feel like fire. It didn't. It felt like setting something heavy down after carrying it so long you'd forgotten your arms could hang loose. Brenna said my name, just my name, the way you'd say it to a child you're about to scold, an old reflex from 6 years of treating me like a problem to be managed. This is grief talking, she said to the room, recovering, smooth, reaching for the wheel. She's not well. She's been under enormous. The document examiner's name is in the report, I said. His credentials are on page 2. The bank's fraud department has a case number. I can read it out loud if anyone wants to write it down. Nobody said she wasn't well after that. The funeral director, bless him, stepped to the front and said in the practiced calm voice of a man who has seen families do terrible things to each other over coffins, that perhaps we could take a short recess. People moved into the lobby in low, electric murmurs. Brenna and her brother left within 10 minutes, and they did not come back, and they did not come to the burial. I read my eulogy at the graveside that afternoon to the maybe 40 people who stayed. The index card was wrinkled from my pocket. My hands shook. I told them about the onions. I told them about the list on the fridge. I told them my father was the gentlest man I ever knew, and that he deserved a softer ending than the one he got, and that I was sorry I couldn't give it to him, but that I could at least give him the truth. One of his old co-workers, a big man who'd installed furnaces for 40 years, cried so hard he had to sit down in the grass. Here is the part nobody tells you about getting justice. It doesn't feel like winning. The legal process took 14 months. Brenna's lawyer fought the fraud findings, then settled when the document examiner held up and the bank's records came in. She had to repay the money, most of it, what hadn't already evaporated. She did not go to prison, which I had wanted badly in the worst of those nights, and which I have since made an uneasy peace with. The house was sold. I didn't fight her on her statutory share, because my lawyer told me it would cost more than it returned, and because, honestly, by then, I just wanted it over. I took what was mine, what my father had actually intended for me, which his real will, the one from before her, the one she didn't know he'd kept a copy of with his lawyer, made perfectly clear. That's the thing she never knew. He'd updated his will when he got sick, the document she was counting on. But 2 years before, when his mind was sharp and his hand was steady, he'd written another one, and he'd told his attorney that whatever happened later, this was the one that said what he meant. I think some part of him knew. I think he saw what was happening and couldn't admit it out loud, not even to himself, but he protected me the only quiet way he could. I found something else after. Going through the boxes from the house, the ones I'd fought to get released, I found a shoebox in the back of his closet that Brenna had clearly never looked in, because it held nothing of any value to her. Inside was the list. My mother's sayings, the one off the fridge, the one Brenna had thrown out years ago. He'd taken it down to keep the peace, and then he'd kept it. He'd kept it the whole time, in a shoebox in the dark where she'd never find it. There were 41 things on it in my mother's handwriting. The last one said, "Tell her the good parts of me are in her too." I read that sitting on the floor of a storage unit, and I cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry at the funeral, or the burial, or any of the 14 months in court. Not angry crying, the other kind. The kind that finally lets the heavy thing all the way down. People ask me sometimes if I regret doing it there, in front of everyone, on his day. For a long time I said yes. It wasn't dignified. It wasn't what he would have chosen. But I've changed my answer. Because here's what I've come to understand. My father spent his last good years swallowing his own truth to keep a fragile peace, and it cost him everything, and it almost cost me the chance to defend his name. I'm not going to live that way. The peace that requires you to stay silent while you're robbed isn't peace. It's just a slower kind of theft. I kept a list. It's on my own refrigerator now, in a different city, in a kitchen my father never saw. 41 things in my mother's hand. Some mornings I add one of his. He was wrong about exactly one thing. That good and gentle man. He used to say the best thing he ever did was me. But I think the best thing he ever did was teach me, without ever meaning to, the difference between keeping the peace and keeping silent. I won't confuse them again, and neither, I hope, will you. I used to believe that keeping the peace and keeping quiet were the same act of love. Watching my father do it taught me they were opposites. Walt swallowed every hard truth to keep his house calm, and that silence didn't protect him. It handed Brenna the keys, one quiet surrender at a time. The line of credit, the forged signature, the spa weekend while he was too weak to stand, none of it happened in a single dramatic theft. It happened because nobody named the small wrong the first time, so the wrong learned it was safe. That's the chain I finally understood standing in that chapel. Every betrayal she committed was permitted by an earlier moment when someone, including me, decided it wasn't worth the fight. So I stopped deciding that. And I learned that standing up for what's right isn't a single brave outburst. It's a refusal to look away that you have to renew every single day. When I heard her on the phone say, "Deal with the daughter," the part of me that wanted to scream wasn't the part that saved us. The part that saved us was the part that got cold and careful, that photographed statements at 2 in the morning, that called a lawyer from a grocery store parking lot and asked exactly the right questions. Anger by itself would have gotten me thrown out of that funeral as the hysterical daughter she described. What protected my father's name was patience, married to clear thinking, knowing the difference between the moment that feels good and the move that actually works. But none of the careful planning would have mattered if I'd quit, and God knows I wanted to. 14 months in court, a lawyer's bills, nights I cried on the floor of a storage unit. The temptation to take a small settlement and disappear was there every week. What carried me through wasn't fury, and it wasn't a perfect plan. It was the plain stubbornness to finish a thing I'd started, to keep showing up for a man who could no longer show up for himself. That endurance, the willingness to stay in something hard long after the adrenaline wears off, is the quietest of the three things I leaned on, and the one I'd never have guessed I had. If you take anything from what happened to Walt and me, let it be this. Protect the people you love by telling the truth early while it's still small and inconvenient, instead of late and catastrophic. Think before you act, especially when you're hurt, because the hurt will lie to you about what helps. And when you're sure you're right, don't just feel it for an afternoon. Carry it the whole long, unglamorous distance it takes to make it real. My father kept my mother's list in a shoebox in the dark for 6 years because he couldn't fight for it in the light. It's on my refrigerator now. I look at it every morning, and I choose the light.